Let me know if everyone can hear me. A thumbs up. All right. Very, very good. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Thanks again for your generous donation. My name is Bernard Wiseman. I am from the Washington, D.C. area, and I've been working with MSF for about 7 years on and off. And I'm going to share my screen a little bit and give you guys some slides to look at and some pictures. I'll give you a little bit of kind of my history with Doctors Without Borders, and then talk a little bit more into kind of our Ukraine operations. Share this. Good. Okay, I started out working with MSF, with Doctors Without Borders in 2015. Before that, I was working with the government. We were working on green buildings and sustainability projects. And a friend of mine who was a water and sanitation engineer really kind of pushed me for over 5 years to join MSF, telling me about how wonderful the organization was and how much good they do across the world. And finally, I said, no problem. Let me do a short mission with Doctors Without Borders. And I was recruited and then headed out on my first assignment to the Congo to work on the measles vaccination campaign. And I started out as a logistician, doing logistics. And kind of a good way to describe logistics is everything non-medical. So in a hospital, you have doctors, nurses, and medical professionals, but then what does it take to kind of run that hospital? You need electricity, you need water, you need construction, you need a lot of different things that have to all work well so that the doctors and nurses can do their job. And so that's kind of how I started out. One way to kind of think about this is one of my projects that I worked on in South Sudan during a refugee crisis. And so what we do in some of these circumstances as a logistician is set up hospitals made out of tents. Sometimes if they're in certain areas where conflict is and people can't reach hospitals, we set up and construct latrines and clean, safe drinking water to make sure that our patients and people within these camps have clean, safe drinking water to make sure that we're not spreading any diseases and there are no outbreaks. And so logistics can, as I said, mean a lot of things. And so it also means a lot of construction. And so this is one of my projects that I worked on in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where we built a new hospital in the middle of a conflict zone. There's a lot of work that goes into the Doctors Without Borders work outside of just medical. Sometimes it is physical. And so on the right, you can see a picture of us building a neonatal ward in the middle of the DRC Congo. The hospital here before we arrived was very cramped and overcrowded. What you would have is 4 babies per bed. It was really not a very good place hygienically. And so what Doctors Without Borders did is they brought me and another team in to kind of construct new buildings in order to spread out these beds, in order to make more beds for more of the children that were coming into the area, and to try to make it a little more, bring up the standards of care so that there weren't any kind of transmission of diseases through the hospital. And so we were here, I was here for about 5 months, and we built a pediatrics ward, neonatal ICUs, as well as an operational theater for surgery as well. So some of the other work that Doctors Without Borders does was kind of how I started out with the organization. We also moved to a large conflict in Bangladesh. We had a lot of Rohingya refugees a few years ago who were escaping some violence within Myanmar. We had a camp of about 1 million people that kind of settled within Bangladesh. You can see a picture here on the screen, just how large and wide it is. A camp of 1 million people takes everything. You're pretty much creating a city. So not only did we build hospitals and clinics, medical clinics for the population, but we also were able to build latrines and water networks to kind of provide the entire camp with water and clean kind of latrines. And so there's a lot of other work that Doctors Without Borders does. And as a logistician, it was a lot of fun because we come in, we see the situation, and we know exactly what to do as soon as possible to make sure that outbreaks are not spreading and that people can survive in these environments. And so even when there's a natural disaster or fires, we can come in afterwards and try to provide and rebuild and try to bring some dignity to the lives of refugees. And so these are some of the works that I did early on within my career before becoming a head of mission and project coordinator with the organization. This is one of our projects in South Sudan with a lot of flooding and a lot of violence within the country. Sometimes there are no roads, and so you have to get to people in different ways. And so in this one project in South Sudan that I worked on in 2021, the whole entire project was boats. And there was no cell phone coverage. And so we were talking with people through HF radio. So a lot of different ways and difficulties that you encounter when you're trying to respond to a disaster or to conflict. You have to be very, very creative. And this is kind of one of the roles of a logistician, or kind of the non-medical side of Doctors Without Borders. In this particular picture, we were responding to a large flooding event along the Nile River in South Sudan, where there were about 10,000 community members who were cut off and trapped on small islands within this large area. And our teams were able, because of our ability to respond very, very quickly, because of our emergency capabilities, to get to the people faster than anyone else. Before the UN would go down there, before any other organization, it was MSF. We were the first organization to meet the people and try to take care of them, providing medical help, but also non-food items, mosquito nets, whatever they needed, we were able to provide very, very quickly. And some of the communities that we found who were kind of really devastated through the flooding, and because of the scale and speed of MSF, we were able to respond very quickly and to make sure that there were no deaths within these communities. We were also able to transport some very severe cases of malaria and pregnant women away from these islands and bring them back to our hospitals in safer areas as well. So it was a really, really interesting project. But a lot of these experiences that I've had over the past few years has kind of prepared me to a certain extent for what we saw last year with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has been and still is a very severe active war. I'll talk to you guys a little bit about what MSF has been doing within Ukraine and kind of supporting the victims of the war, as well as what kind of my teams and I were doing in a specific area as well. So as you all know, in February 24th of 2022, Russian forces invaded Ukraine along the north, east, and south of the country. MSF Doctors Without Borders had projects ongoing in the country of Ukraine already, doing a lot of HIV and TB work. However, with the invasion and the conflict, those projects changed very, very quickly from an HIV and tuberculosis projects to a rapid response to the fighting. So what we saw very quickly with the fighting was a lot of internally displaced populations trying to escape from these active war zones, and also refugees leaving the country of Ukraine to the surrounding countries. So you had only 5 to 10 million refugees in Moldova, Romania, Poland, and some of the surrounding countries, as well as many millions who did not leave Ukraine but were stuck in Ukraine along the front lines in small shelters and government facilities. We kind of call them collective centers, where people who lost their homes, who lost a place to live, would collect and try to survive together. As you can see on this screen, this is a kind of an older map of where our activities were during the invasion over the summer. As you can see from the previous map, the fighting was in kind of concentrated along the north, east, and south, but Doctors Without Borders was working all across the country, because you have seen so many displaced populations moving from the east into many parts of the west. So a lot of those towns and communities in the west were overloaded. And so there were a lot of displaced refugees coming to those areas, and they needed supplies and support. And so we created a lot of distribution networks for non-food items, very simple things from jackets to sleeping bags to some food, all the way up to providing medical care for individuals who had to escape and run away from the fighting, who did not have any more medication, and a lot of the supply lines had been cut off, and so MSF was able to provide consultations and non-communicable disease medication as well. So if you look in the top right of the screen, there's a town called Kharkiv. It is the second largest city in Ukraine, and that's where I spent this summer, from May to September, working with a lot of the displaced populations and a lot of the medical facilities within the area. Kharkiv was on the front lines of the fighting. So you had a lot of people who had left Kharkiv, but still a lot of people who could not leave and were stuck within the city. When I arrived in May with my team, the city was almost surrounded by Russian forces. And so the Russians were shelling the city every day and every night in an attempt to capture the second largest city of Ukraine, so which put the population in a very vulnerable position. What the Russian forces were mainly targeting were government facilities, hospitals, any kind of infrastructure that made it unsafe or untenable to live there. I think they were trying to push a lot of the populations out of the city in order to try to take the city more easily. And so any sort of government facility or gymnasium or university, a lot of those buildings were targeted by the Russian forces. You also, which meant that a lot of school children, a lot of university students, a lot of elderly were forced from where they were living, and they became displaced. And so what we saw a lot of very early on when I was in Kharkiv was that many of these people who were running away and trying to escape the shelling, they found themselves underground. Where is the safest place to be with when the conflict is very, very intense? Well, the subways, of course. And so we had hundreds and thousands of people living on platforms and living in metro stations, all underground, in order to make sure that they could protect themselves and their families. Men, women, and children were living in these subway stations for many months. And so the first thing that our teams were doing was making sure that we were providing medical care to these populations, whether they were hurt by shrapnel, whether they had difficulties finding medications for their chronic illnesses. Our teams were there every night to do consultations to make sure that the populations were being supported. When you run from these situations, you're running as fast as you can. You don't have time to grab your jacket. You don't have time to grab your diabetes medication. You don't have time to grab your hypertension medication. So a lot of people in these kind of circumstances could end up dying just from normal chronic illness. And so this is kind of where our team started, working with a lot of the elderly populations who did not have access to that care. And so we would do a lot of distributions, not only medical. So if you're running from the violence, you also need hygiene kits. You need soap, you need water, you need toothbrush, you need toothpaste. And so just very, very simple things could go a really long way, especially for the people that were stuck in the subways. And so we spent a lot of time working in these subways and working with the populations, and most of our staff were also Ukrainian as well. And so it was a real, I think the communities were really, really happy that we were providing this, especially as close as we were to the front lines. Another thing, as I said before, we were also doing distributions of material. If you're underground in a subway, it can get very, very cold at night. And so we were doing blankets, we were doing coats, we were doing sleeping bags, anything very simple and basic that someone might need to live for an extended period of time in these locations we were providing. And so we were also working with other groups to provide hot meals in order to make sure that a lot of the kids and a lot of the elderly were able to eat. Because sometimes if the action or the conflict was very, very intense, people would not be able to leave for several days, and they would be stuck within these subways. One of the most interesting things that we were really providing outside of kind of the standard medical care was mental health care. When you are in these circumstances and these situations for a very long time, um, it's very easy to develop long-term, post-traumatic stress, and it's a very frustrating and difficult time to be in these locations. And so we were able to take teams of psychologists to work in these displacement centers in order to work with a lot of the children, a lot of the mothers, a lot of people that were stuck in these situations with sometimes very little hope. Sometimes some of their houses might have been destroyed, or they cannot contact their family members, and so our psychologists would be coming in many times per week to each of these locations to do mental health groups, also working with children. And kind of one of the most heartening things that I saw was to see children stuck as displaced populations, but to see them drawing, to see them coloring, to see them laughing and playing, even when there were other things outside of the center that were scary, they were able to feel safe, and our teams were able to work with them. We also set up hotlines so that if people had issues or frustrations or stress, they could call our psychologists anytime throughout the city, 24 hours a day. We were also able to set up kind of a mail system so that we could provide pharmaceutical drugs to people who were running out of their supplies, even if there was an intense period of fighting. So we were trying very innovative ways to support the populations who were really suffering from the conflict during that period of time. And it was one of the first, really large scale mental health teams that we had really deployed across the country. And it was a really well received. When I used to go travel between villages outside of the city, and I would talk with mayors and I would talk with community leaders just about, what are the needs and what are the people asking for? And I would talk about kind of the services that we could provide to them. When I said mental health care, when I said psychologists, their eyes lit up. And it was one thing they knew that they didn't have any access to, but they knew their people needed. And most of the time, the mayors would raise their hand and say, I'm first in line, because the amount of stress and frustration and difficulty it is to kind of, to organize a community during these events. So it was a very great program that we were running during that period of time. We were also able to work with the healthcare workers. So, the Ukrainian healthcare system, although it was damaged and there was a decrease in the availability of care, there was still a pretty good level of healthcare being provided to the citizens of Kharkiv and across the country. However, they had never seen this kind of conflict before, so a lot of the things were new for them. So another thing that our teams were doing kind of trainings, like surgical trainings on how to respond to emergencies that have mass casualties. And so we were doing a lot of trainings throughout the country with surgical teams, but also with emergency teams, so that they knew how to do triages in a way when they have a large kind of mass casualty event, when a lot of people come in at once, how to know who is the more priority case, how to make sure and manage a room in those circumstances. So our teams have a lot of experience all across the world working in those situations, but a lot of the Ukrainians did not. So we were able to do a lot of trainings for many hospitals across the country during that time. And we were also able to supply material across lines as well. Sometimes because of certain fighting or changes in the conflict, certain areas could be inaccessible. However, populations needed support and needed materials. And with our groups of volunteers, with our networks, we were able to provide long distance counseling through hotlines, long distance support to medical facilities who may have been cut off due to the fighting. And we were able to find routes to get people the material and medicine that they needed, even if it wasn't accessible to everybody. So, as we say before, Doctors Without Borders is a neutral, independent organization. So we work on any side of the conflict to make sure that people who are most vulnerable and most in need get the care that they need. It's kind of impartiality to make sure that we prioritize the patient and not think about the political context. And that's kind of one of our founding principles. And that kind of leads us to make sure that anybody, whatever side of the conflict they're on, if they're a patient and if they're in need, we get the material to them. And it's something that we're very, very strong about. And the volunteers and Ukrainians and our staff were just amazing, trying to make sure that every small village along that front line was taken care of, to make sure that we got material to them, no matter how difficult it could be. And so it was a really, really difficult time, but also I think really, really hopeful for me that we were able to get to the people who needed it most. And this meant all along the front line, in the subways, you name the town, we were able to get there. And I think that was a real credit to our staff. We also had the medical train. I think maybe we've talked about this before, or you've seen some of the work. And the medical train is a really interesting and amazing innovation. You're at the front lines, and there are war wounded. And the changes of those front lines can be very dramatic very quickly. So how do you make sure that people in hospitals and people who need more care are safe? And that is to get them, to a safer part of the country as fast as possible. But to move patients requires really a lot of care, and to make sure that we have stabilized patients, and to make sure that we can take care of those patients as they go from point A to point B. And this is kind of a marvel, and kind of the logistics side of Doctors Without Borders is someone created, or someone, took the idea of transporting patients and turned a regular Ukrainian train into an ICU and hospital, to make sure that during the 4 to 8 to 12-hour trip between the front lines and safer hospitals to the west, that we can make sure that we could take care of patients and make sure they get the care they needed. And I believe thousands of patients have been transferred, and not only just war wound, but as people flooded from the east to the west, a lot of the hospitals and even mental hospitals have been overwhelmed. So we were able to also take psychiatric patients who were in really bad situations in Kharkiv. We moved about 200 of them from Kharkiv to Kiev, the capital, as well, to make sure that the hospitals and clinics were not overwhelmed, and to make sure that everyone's getting the care that they needed. Later on, at the end of my service, at the end of my assignment, we created a rehabilitation program with a lot of the hospitals in the western part of Ukraine to take care of all of the people who needed physical rehabilitation. Just like mental health care, the sooner you get to somebody, the more effect you can have. It's the same thing with rehabilitation for war wounded. The sooner you can get kind of rehabilitative services to those patients, the better outcomes they have. And so we were able very, very quickly to work with a lot of those patients very, 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 very quickly. So thousands of patients, thousands of consultations with our orthopedic specialists and our surgical teams. And it was a really great program. And I think they're still running it to this day. As you know, the war is continuing, and our teams are still on the front lines and still working in Ukraine. And it's almost just over 1 year on, and I think still working hard and still making sure we're taking care of all of the most vulnerable patients. And kind of my job when I'm over in Ukraine, I was the emergency project coordinator. So a lot of my job there is working with governments, working with local leaders, trying to make sure we're finding the right populations, but also security management. Working in these places can be quite dangerous. If we want to get to the most vulnerable, sometimes that means we go to some places that can also be dangerous as well for our staff. And so it's very important, as my job is to make sure that we're not taking any undue risks, to make sure we're not exposing our patients or our staff to unnecessary conflict. And so it's a very, very, very delicate balance, especially with the changes in conflict within Ukraine, and how fast that dynamic can shift. So on the left is the bunker where I was living for a few months. I don't know if anyone's stayed with 12 people in a small bunker with bunk beds. I came from a family of 6, so it wasn't new to me, but not everybody has that experience. If you get one snorer, the whole team just gets really upset for the for the whole week. So we have to make sure people are safe. We have to make sure that we can all live in a small space together. But I think you make sure that you're in a location that you can take care of the patients as quickly as possible and as safely as possible. So for me and my team, this was our location for a few months. But anyway, it's something that Doctors Without Borders, we're one of the few organizations that get to the front lines just because we're a medical organization and we have to, and we're an emergency medical organization, and it's really important that as we get to the patients. And so it's something that we take very, very seriously, and I'm glad we were able to do it. In the back on the first picture, you can see the map of the subway system. And we were visiting all of those subway stations every day to make sure that the population was receiving adequate care. And that's me. Right before I left Ukraine, a little tired, but definitely very hopeful. And the teams and the villages and our patients that I met during my time in Ukraine are just incredible to me, and how hardworking and just how much time people spent to make sure that we were taken care of. Even that last consultation and that last village to make sure we got there. It was incredible, and I haven't seen it really on every mission, but this was definitely something that I took to heart, and it's a kind of an experience that will stay with me for the rest of my life. But yeah, I think I'll open it up for questions from there.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you so much. So happy to take questions, or if anybody has anything they'd like to ask Bernard about his experience or anything about Doctors Without Borders generally, we're happy to take those questions for you.
Okay, now don't jump all at once. Okay, thank you so much, Bernard. That was very, very good insight in all of your tremendous experiences there. And yes, well, those of us that, we all Pan Am flight attendants. So yes, we have bunked together in many places all over the world, but not under such extreme circumstances, of course. Yeah, we're just so impressed with your work, and it's just a wonderful experience, I think, for you also, that you can talk to your grandchildren about one day. And so go ahead, anybody that wants to ask a question, you can, I think you can unmute yourself to ask. Is that correct, Irene? Yes. Yes. So if you'd like to ask a question, just unmute yourself and speak up.
Okay, this is Nancy. I apologize that I cannot make my camera work. And thank you, Bernard, for all of that information. I'm curious to learn a little bit more of the living conditions that these people, these Ukrainians, are enduring in the subway. You mentioned that they were receiving medical and psychological help, and you were trying to keep the children from being so depressed and so forth. Can you just paint the picture a little more fully for us? Like, how did they make food? Did you have to bring in kitchens and that sort of thing? I'd appreciate knowing some more about that.
Can you all hear me?
Can you hear Bernard?
Yes.
Okay. It can really depend. So there were a lot of different places where the displaced populations with Some of it were on the subway platforms. You could just see families just living out in the open on a subway platform on a mattress. Some families had tents that they were living in on the subway platforms. But it wasn't just underground subways as well. There were other collection facilities. Some places were kindergartens. Schools were closed for the summer, so that you had families from different parts of the country fleeing, and they were living in just kind of a regular kindergarten classroom. Some places were also dormitories or old gymnasiums. So it really depended kind of where you ended up during the fighting. And so that's kind of what it would look like. It could depend on which location they were in and which community they found themselves in. What was the other part of your question, Nancy? I'm sorry.
I think you answered it. I was just asking from a human perspective how they were able to sustain life underground, and how did they get food and that sort of thing if they were all hiding down there. Were you supplying them with that, or other NGOs? I know you all are working together over in Ukraine, as both Irenes have kept us informed. MSF has a lot of partners and other charities, international charities, that you're all combining efforts, which is admirable and necessary, I'm sure. And then I do have one more question. You mentioned the war train and the hospital train and getting people to the war injured for physical rehab. How, and you said it was thousands. Is that continuing? I'm sure it is. And how does it, I mean, I can't imagine being hurt very badly and, you don't want to be moved. And then you're on a train that is not very still when it's moving. So that must have been a challenge for all those patients, not to mention the medical staff. You must have had to give them some pretty severe drugs to keep them out of pain. I would think.
Yeah, and so just to finish answering your first question, food, if you're in a kindergarten, some of these locations, they were able to have a kitchen and provide food. A lot of the community members would also, do donations to some of those collective centers. Underground in a subway, there's no kitchens, and it's not so safe to have an open fire, especially with so many people living on the platforms. And so individuals within the city and other NGOs that we worked with were able to create collective centers and have a kitchen where they made a lot of food every day and then distributed it inside of the subways. But also, if you are, living on a subway platform and there's 400 people, the subways still only have one bathroom or two bathrooms. So that was very, very difficult as well to try to make sure that everybody could stay clean. In terms of the medical train, yeah, it's a wonder, and it's still amazing to me how quickly they were able to put it together, and how many people they were able to provide care to. And so, yeah, as you said, it's not an ideal location, being on a train, traveling for many, many hours, but the level of care that they were able to provide to those war wounded is incredible. I mean, literally turned one of the cars into an ICU, a very critical level of care, with a large number of doctors and nurses per patient, while some other cars were more stable patients. And so it depended on which patients you were. But yeah, it's incredible the level of care they were able to provide. So it was really nice. Yeah. And compared to some other locations that I've worked, in some other conflict zones, being in a Ukrainian car, it can sometimes be better than some of the tent hospitals that I've had to work in some other refugee camps without electricity and things like this. So we provide a high level of care wherever we are. We try to maintain that. It's very important to us. So it's one of our founding principles. Yeah.
Thank you.
All this reminded me of World War II in Paris. People, every time there was bombardment, they would go underneath the houses. It was like a city underground. Do they have that kind of thing in Ukraine, where they can go under the house and hide from the bombardment?
And this is Danielle speaking from the Miami chapter. Go ahead.
Thank you. I should have introduced myself.
It's okay. Go ahead, Bernard.
Danielle, for your question. I mean, so if you have your own individual house, then sometimes, yes, you could have you could definitely have a basement. But for people who are living in the city and who are living in high rises, you know, if you're living in an apartment, you don't really have a basement. So what individual apartment buildings did was have a kind of a collective, you know, center for everybody in the basement. In some of the areas that we were working, you know, in some of the dormitories, we would put our own supplies and water and material just in case there was a kind of an airstrike and our teams needed to go underground for a few hours. So everywhere we worked, we made sure there was a safe place to work and a safe place to fall back to in case there was a change. So yeah, some places do have their own basements, some places maybe not so much, but the subways kind of acted as a de facto, you know, location in case of bombing and in case the people didn't have those shelters themselves.
Yeah. And what year was MSF created?
1971.
1971. Oh, okay. Okay, thank you. Yeah, because there was no help during World War II for the civilians. I remember my mother going all through that.
Yes. Yeah.
No food. You know, if you didn't have help from someone in the countryside, you were half starving.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a really good point. You know, sometimes even today, you know, in this context, you know, roads are cut off. People can't get to people. People can't access, you know, houses. Sometimes people who have a car can leave, but people who don't can't. And making sure that community members were checking in on each other, and also our work with these volunteer networks gave us a lot of information as soon as possible so that we could respond and get material to every town and community. You know, it's really easy to work in a city sometimes, but some of the towns along the front lines, if they get cut off, it's very, very difficult to get them supplies and some aid. So yeah, just for us, it was very important to get information gathering, to make sure we were networking with all of the community leaders in the area so that if something changed in context, we could respond accordingly. So yeah, very, very difficult. You're right, Danielle.
Well, I really admire what you do. You do a wonderful job and very much needed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, and as Danielle brought out the point that many of us that are from Europe, including myself from Germany, our parents, of course, went through World War II as, you know, as children, and there were absolutely horrendous experiences there, and many times absolutely no food and horrific circumstances that lasted for quite some time. And they, you know, MSF wasn't there, or CARE wasn't there yet. And, you know, CARE came about with the Marshall Plan in 1945. So yes, it is, I mean, to us, it's just, I mean, to everyone, it's horrific what we see happening in the Ukraine. And of course, other parts of the world have horrendous problems, but the Ukraine is close to our heart because we see a repeat performance there, you know, a little bit of World War II, and it's also unnecessary. And so, you know, that people are being put through all this suffering. So we really do admire, yes, like Danielle said, what you all do in the field and everywhere, you know, logistics, like you said, every part of it is very important to make people feel more safe, even in a horrendous situation. So yeah, anybody else would like to ask a question? I see.
I have a question.
Jan, go ahead. Okay.
Yeah, I'm from San Francisco chapter.
Okay.
And just want to know how long you were there, Bernard?
Just about 4 months, 3 to 4 months.
I can't hear too good.
I think it got a little garbled.
3 to 4 months. Is that more clear? Can you hear me?
Is this better?
3 to 4 months, I think, was it what you said?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay, thank you. And did any MSF the service people died or got hurt during working in Ukraine?
To my knowledge, no. It was very difficult to take care of our staff and to make sure that we didn't have any casualties. But that being said, with the scale and the weapons used in the war, it's nearly impossible to guarantee. But I think we were very careful, very safe, and from my understanding, I think none of our staff were casualties of the war.
Are there anyone still working in Ukraine?
I'll try this. I do know that we had staff who were personally affected by the war and that they lost their homes, or family members lost their home, or family members were hurt. So we do have staff that have been personally impacted by the war.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so, I mean, a lot of our staff were living in cities.
Oh,
we lost Bernard. I'm sorry. Bernard, we couldn't hear you. We still can't hear you. Right now, we don't hear you.
Hear me now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, but as I was trying to say, yeah, a lot of our staff were affected in terms of losing houses, family members hurt. Some of our staff were able to send their wives and children outside of the country, but they themselves were unable to leave. And so some of our staff were living in these collective centers and working in them in order to take care of their community. So it was very, very the energy and the heart from our staff working in these locations was really impressive, and the dedication. They really felt like this was a really important thing, and we would have to tell them to quit so they could take some time off for themselves. But I think it meant a lot that we were working with them and we were there.
I see.
Hi, Bernard. Oops, sorry.
The last question is, did you have any problem communicating?
Could you say it again? Sorry, the speaker was off here. Do you mind? I saw Mary Emerson that you were raising your hand.
After Jan finishes.
The last question is, did you have any problem communicating? Because, I don't know, do you speak any Ukrainian or?
I wish. So in most contexts where we work, 90% of our staff are local to the country, and only about 10% are international from across the world, depending upon the needs, depending upon the profiles. And so, the 90% of our staff were Ukrainian staff, from Kharkiv or from the surrounding area. And many of them spoke English. So if I had a meeting with, one of the ministries, or if I had a meeting with a local mayor, I would always have, a member of our team with us to translate. When our psychologists, come, we have international psychologists, but also we have local psychologists as well from the country of Ukraine. And so they are, working kind of one-on-one with the patients, and we have some of our international psychologists as managers to kind of organize and give trainings and stuff. But yeah, we make sure we're working in the language of the country where we're working. Yeah. But I learned a few words, but me trying to speak Ukrainian now, I think would be embarrassing. But yeah.
Great, thank you.
Hi, this is Mary. I'm in Hawaii, and Jan asked, her last question was my first question, and you answered it. I'm listening to you talk about your work, and it's so communication oriented that I wondered about the language and actually the communication infrastructure there. Is it good? It survives cell phone usage, internet, all of these things are available for you to do what you need to do?
For the most part, yes. But depends where you are. In the main cities of Kharkiv, more or less the infrastructure of water, internet, phone networks, they stayed pretty good. However, the further you get away from the main city or the further you get to the front lines, that can be hit or miss. And so sometimes, getting in contact with people in certain villages was very difficult, and we would have to really go there ourselves just to talk with people and to make sure we were interacting with our patients. Even trying to get information or talk to people on the other side of the conflict. The Ukrainians who were cut off by the fighting was very difficult. Sometimes once a week we could get information to them and get information from them in order to make sure that their needs were being met. We were able to get some people from across the line who had severe cases of medical needs to get to a border site and take them and bring them to a hospital, and coordinating that when you can only speak to somebody 5 minutes a week was very difficult, especially with someone who has a severe medical needs. So it could be quite difficult. But for some of the larger populated areas, the hotlines were running 24/7, and we were getting a lot of calls, and so I think we did what we could.
Sounds challenging.
A little bit, a little bit.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else would like to, we have a few minutes left. Now's your chance. Well, also I would like to say that this whole session is recorded, so we will, furnish you with a link that you can watch it again or pass it on to your chapters and your friends. That I know a lot of people have questions about how the Ukraine is faring and overall MSF. So go ahead. Anybody else, please?
I put myself on. I'm Lillian Walby, and I just want to say thank you for going there and doing it for the people, because that is needed and not everyone has the strength to go. So thank you, Bernard.
Yeah, thank you, Lillian. But also thank you all for your support. Without you all, we can't get to the places that we go. So thank you all for your support.
You're very welcome. You have our back. I mean, we have your back and you have ours. I hope it works both ways, right? So Irene, would you like to say anything in closing? I guess we have about 5 more minutes to go. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm happy to. I just wanted to check. I did see that Leslie Manning had unmuted. So I just wanted to see if Leslie had a question with these last few minutes.
Yeah, Leslie?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Okay, Leslie, we can't hear you very well. Can you turn up your volume or something? Or?
Yeah, it's up.
Okay, we can hear you now.
All right, let me turn it more. Okay, so Bernard, I'm Leslie, and I'm in the Atlanta chapter, and I'm one of a family of 7, so I know what it's like to sleep in bunks, but I haven't done it for 50, 60 years, so I feel your pain there. In all this work with MSF, I never even thought about the logistics part of it. So I'm really grateful for your input. We do hear about the medical staff, but we don't hear about the logistical side. And it's amazing, it's astounding. I mean, everything you guys do is great. And thank you so much for sharing your story. I guess the only question I have is, what is the typical timeline for the different teams that go to work in a particular place? It probably depends on whether it's something like Ukraine that's under fire, or something maybe, you know, not under so much direct impact. But like, you were there for 4 months. Is that a typical assignment?
Thank you, Leslie. It really depends, like you said. It can depend on the context, but also it depends on the specialist or the availability. So for Ukraine, in the place where I was, it was a very intense location. And so you are working day and night as much as possible, but at that speed and frequency, you know, you can only work for so long. So for kind of an emergency response of that nature, you know, 3 months is quite a lot. For other contexts where we are kind of more long-term with different responses, yeah, you can work from 6 months to a year to sometimes multiple years. But it really depends. But also it depends on the role. For some of our surgical programs, you know, to get a surgeon for 6 weeks is a miracle. So, you know, they have shorter missions sometimes than a logistician who may have more flexibility to stay longer in a given location. So it can really depend. But yeah, I think you're right. Some of the kind of high level emergencies is quite short.
Thank you.
And I have one more question. This is Nancy, and I'm also in Atlanta. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that. How many MSF staff from outside of Ukraine are on any given day? What would be the average of people in country?
The number of international staff members in Ukraine? Is that what you're asking, Nancy? I'm sorry.
Yes, yes.
Ooh, Irene's got this one.
Can you hear me now? Okay, I wouldn't say that there really is an average number, because it depends on the size of the response that's being provided. You know, some are smaller, some are much larger, like what Bernard was talking about earlier when he was in Bangladesh for the Rohingya refugee crisis. It was quite a large refugee camp there. It requires a lot of staff. The way we think of the staff more, the way we look at it, is more that at any project, between 80 to 90, usually closer to 90% of the staff are what we call national staff. So in the case of Ukraine, you know, having the Ukrainian staff members there, that's the way we kind of measure the number of staff, is looking more at ensuring that we're hiring locally. There's a number of reasons we prioritize that. Some of that is that it just makes sense, you know, talking about translation, also just kind of cultural understandings, also being able to have impact and inroads with the community is why we do prioritize hiring locally as much as we can. So generally speaking, between 80 and 90% of any MSF project is locally hired staff.
Very interesting. Well, we certainly thank you for taking time away from your families to help so many people around the world. It's a true gift, and we're happy to help you do that.
We're very grateful for the support. You know, we've had some good conversations with World Wings International over the last few years, and we've been very fortunate with some great presenters. So I'm very happy that you all were able to join us today. Irene Schwartz, I'll share the link to the recording with you once we have it ready to share with your chapters, or however you choose to distribute that.
Yeah, just share it with me, and then I will distribute it to everyone.
Great.
That would be fantastic.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for your time today. And thank you to Bernard for sharing his experiences and his time. As always, please reach out to me if you have any questions, or I suppose maybe through Irene or Nancy. But I'm happy to send along any follow-up questions people or answers that people might need.
Okay, thank you so much, Irene and Bernard. It was very insightful, and you know, we're always so happy to get another side, another perspective of MSF to better understand what we're supporting. So, and we love the organization and all the good work that you're doing around the world. So, thank you so much, Irene, for facilitating this, and I thank all the world winners around the world that joined today, and the rest of you can please pass on the recording when we get it. So I'll sign off, and thank you so much. Until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.